The ballroom smelled of starved women and stolen money. It was the apex of the Manhattan social season at the Grand Astor Hotel, a glittering fortress of old wealth and new corruption. Beneath the massive crystal chandeliers, the ultra-elite of the city moved like fragile ghosts. This was the modern era of high society, defined by hollow cheeks, protruding collarbones, and the sharp architectural angles of bodies maintained by expensive injections and deliberate starvation. They wore gowns that cost more than a suburban home, draped over frames that looked as though they might snap under the weight of the diamonds around their necks. The air was thick with the scent of imported truffles, spilled champagne, and the suffocating desperation to remain relevant. Maeve Gallagher stood in the shadows near the service doors, a heavy silver tray balanced perfectly on her fingertips. She was the senior event coordinator for the agency running the gala, but to the billionaires and socialites in the room, she was entirely invisible. She was part of the architecture, a piece of furniture meant to facilitate their luxury without ever intruding upon it. Maeve preferred it that way. Her invisibility was her armor. In a room full of women who prided themselves on taking up as little physical space as possible, Maeve was a stark, undeniable contrast. She was a size 20, her body soft, solid, and grounded in a reality these people could not comprehend. Her curves were a source of quiet strength, a physical manifestation of her refusal to shrink herself for a world that demanded less of her. But in the brutal, superficial hierarchy of Manhattan high society, her size made her a target for the casual cruelty of the elite. She adjusted the collar of her stiff black uniform, ignoring the dull ache in her lower back and the sharp pain radiating from her feet. She had been standing for 9 hours, orchestrating the chaotic ballet of caterers, florists, and security personnel. She could not afford to rest. Every agonizing hour of overtime was calculated in her mind against the crushing weight of her reality. $98,000. That was the exact amount of medical debt her mother had left behind after a brutal, losing battle with cancer. Add to that the suffocating student loans that had promised her a way out of the working class, and Maeve was drowning. She lived her life on a razor-thin margin, terrified of a single missed paycheck, a single mistake that could send her tumbling into the abyss of eviction and bankruptcy. So, she swallowed her pride. She endured the sneers, the dismissive waves, and the whispered insults. She did her job with a hyper-competent brilliance that kept the agency afloat, even if her corrupt boss took all the credit. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom suddenly swung open, and the atmospheric pressure in the room violently shifted. The low hum of string quartets and hollow laughter died instantly. A suffocating silence rolled across the marble floor, heavy and cold. Maeve stepped further into the shadows, her breath catching in her throat as she watched the apex predator of New York City enter the room. Victor Thorne did not walk into a room. He claimed it. He was the undisputed head of the Thorne Syndicate, a modern, ruthless crime family that operated behind the impenetrable shield of a massive, legitimate real estate and hospitality empire. He was a man built of violence and immaculate tailoring, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating a terrifying, predatory stillness. Victor moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew he could destroy everyone in his path. His bespoke charcoal suit clung to the heavy muscle of his frame, a stark contrast to the soft, pampered billionaires who suddenly looked very small in his presence. Beside him walked Kieran Vance, his silent, deadly right-hand man, whose eyes scanned the room with the cold detachment of an executioner. The Thorne Syndicate was not old-school mafia. They did not operate in the shadows of back alleys. They operated in boardrooms, in luxury penthouses, and in the highest echelons of corporate warfare. They were a corporate syndicate, blending high-stakes financial manipulation with brutal, street-level ruthlessness. Everyone in the room knew that the foundation of Victor Thorne's empire was built on blood, but they were all too terrified, and too greedy, to care. The socialites immediately began to preen, their desperate eyes tracking Victor's every movement. They arched their fragile backs, pushed out their collarbones, and tried to catch the attention of the most dangerous man in the city. Victor ignored them all. His dark, cold eyes swept over the glittering crowd with absolute disdain. He valued substance, loyalty, and competence. The superficial beauty of the starving women around him meant absolutely nothing to him. They were empty vessels, and Victor Thorne had no use for emptiness. Maeve watched him from the safety of the service corridor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he commanded the space. He did not demand respect. His very existence extracted it. She turned her attention back to her tray, desperate to remain unnoticed. But as she stepped forward to clear a table of empty crystal flutes, a sharp, bony elbow deliberately slammed into her side. Maeve stumbled. the heavy silver tray dipping dangerously, but her hyper-competent reflexes kicked in. She caught the balance just before the crystal shattered, her knuckles turning white from the strain. She looked up to see Astoria Kensington standing directly in her path. Astoria was a painfully thin, cruel heiress whose father, Charles Kensington, was a hedge fund billionaire. Astoria was the epitome of the toxic elite, a woman who used her body and her status as weapons to inflict microaggressions on anyone she deemed beneath her. Astoria looked Maeve up and down, her lips curling into a venomous sneer. She leaned in close, the smell of expensive champagne and sour malice rolling off her breath. Astoria whispered that Maeve was taking up too much space. She told her that she was an eyesore, a massive, lumbering beast ruining the aesthetic of the gala. She ordered Maeve to get out of her sight before she had her fired for breathing the same air as the guests. Maeve felt a hot flush of shame and rage burn the back of her neck. Her hands trembled, not from the weight of the tray, but from the violent urge to hurl the crystal directly into Astoria's hollow face. But the numbers flashed in her mind. $98,000, the past due notices, the threat of eviction. Her economic desperation was a chain around her throat, choking the defiance out of her. Maeve swallowed the humiliation, her face a mask of professional blankness. She stepped back, bowing her head slightly, and murmured a quiet apology. Astoria laughed, a sharp, grating sound, and turned on her diamond stilettos. She immediately began to glide toward the VIP section, her eyes locked on Victor Thorne. She was determined to seduce the syndicate boss, completely unaware that Victor was watching her approach with the cold, dead eyes of a shark looking at a piece of floating garbage. Before Maeve could retreat to the kitchen, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. She flinched, turning to see Bradley Sterling, the regional director of the luxury event agency. Bradley was a cowardly, sweating man who wore cheap cologne and suits that were slightly too tight. He was secretly laundering money for the Romano syndicate, the fading, old-school mafia rivals who were currently bleeding territory and cash to Victor Thorne. Bradley was a nervous wreck on the best of days, but tonight, with Victor in the room, he looked like a man standing on the gallows. Bradley shoved a heavy crystal tray into Maeve's hands. Resting in the center was a bottle of 50-year-old Macallan Scotch and 2 heavy crystal tumblers. He ordered her to take it to Mr. Thorne's table immediately. He hissed that she needed to be perfect, that she could not afford to make a single mistake, or he would ruin her life. Maeve's stomach plummeted. Walking out into the center of the ballroom, directly toward the apex predator, was the exact opposite of being invisible, but she had no choice. She gripped the edges of the tray, her knuckles aching, and began the long, agonizing walk across the marble floor. The ballroom seemed to stretch out before her, the distance to the VIP table feeling like miles. She kept her eyes focused on the amber liquid in the bottle, ignoring the stares of the elite as she moved through the crowd. She was halfway there when she saw Astoria Kensington standing near Victor's table, holding a glass of champagne and leaning over to expose her chest. Victor was not looking at Astoria. His dark, heavy gaze was locked entirely on Maeve. The intensity of his stare hit her like a physical blow. It was not a look of disgust or dismissal or the casual indifference she was used to. It was a look of absolute, terrifying possession. It was the look of a man who had just found exactly what he was looking for. Maeve's breath hitched. She broke eye contact, her heart pounding wildly as she approached the table. Astoria noticed the shift in Victor's attention. She followed his gaze, her eyes landing on Maeve. The heiress's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She could not fathom why the most powerful man in the room was looking at the plus-size event coordinator instead of her. As Maeve took the final step toward the table, Astoria made her move. With a cruel, calculated smirk, the heiress deliberately thrust her diamond-encrusted stiletto directly into Maeve's path. Maeve's heavy black work shoe caught the heel. The momentum of her forward stride betrayed her. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Maeve felt her balance vanish, her center of gravity tipping forward. The heavy crystal tray slipped from her grasp. She braced herself for the agonizing impact of the marble floor, for the humiliating sound of shattering glass, and for the inevitable, career-ending screaming match that would follow. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the fall, but the impact never came. Instead, a violent blur of motion displaced the air in front of her. A massive, heavily muscled arm wrapped around her waist with terrifying speed and bone-crushing strength. The force of the catch knocked the breath from Maeve's lungs. She was hauled forward, her feet leaving the ground entirely as she was pulled directly into a wall of solid, unyielding muscle. She gasped, her eyes flying open. She was sitting sideways in Victor Thorne's lap. The heavy crystal tray had been caught by Kieran Vance, who stood perfectly still, holding the 50-year-old Macallan without a single drop spilled. But Maeve could not focus on the tray. Her entire universe had shrunk to the terrifying, overwhelming presence of the man holding her. Victor's large hand spanned the entire width of her waist, his long fingers digging possessively into the soft curve of her hip. The heat radiating from his body was immense, burning through the cheap fabric of her uniform. He smelled of expensive cedar, dark tobacco, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. Maeve was paralyzed. She was a heavy woman, well over 200 pounds, yet Victor held her suspended in his lap as effortlessly as if she weighed nothing at all. His raw, terrifying strength completely bypassed all of her physical insecurities. She looked up into his face. His jaw was clenched, a muscle ticking violently beneath his skin. His dark eyes were blazing with a demonic, simmering rage, but that rage was not directed at her. Absolute, suffocating silence fell over the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing. The billionaire stopped breathing. No one moved. Maeve tried to scramble out of his lap, her face burning with a deep, frantic panic. She stammered a desperate apology, her hands pushing weakly against his broad chest. Victor's grip tightened, locking her in place. He did not let her go. He looked down at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. He told her to breathe. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone rumble that vibrated through his chest and directly into her bones. It was a command, not a request. Maeve froze, her chest heaving as she stared up at him. Victor slowly turned his head, his dark, lethal gaze locking onto Astoria Kensington. The heiress was standing a few feet away, her face drained of all color, her diamond stiletto still extended slightly from the trip. The temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. Victor asked Astoria if she found it amusing to put her hands on what belonged to him. The words echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. Maeve's breath hitched. She did not belong to him. She had never spoken to this man in her life, but the absolute, terrifying conviction in his voice made it sound like an undeniable law of the universe. Astoria trembled, her fragile frame shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. She tried to speak, to offer a charming laugh, to explain that it was just an accident, that the clumsy staff member had tripped over her own feet. Victor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He leaned forward slightly, keeping Maeve securely in his lap, and told Astoria that she was a hollow, pathetic creature who used cruelty to mask her own irrelevance. He stated, with cold, clinical precision, that he had watched her deliberately stick her foot out. Panic erupted in the VIP section. Charles Kensington, Astoria's billionaire father, rushed forward, his face slick with nervous sweat. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, begging Mr. Thorne to forgive his daughter's foolishness, promising that it was a misunderstanding. Victor's eyes shifted to the hedge fund billionaire. The apex predator had found his prey. Victor asked Charles if he was in a position to negotiate forgiveness. Charles swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the silent room. He tried to maintain his facade of elite power, puffing out his chest and stating that the Kensingtons were one of the most respected families in Manhattan. Victor smiled. It was a terrifying, blood-chilling expression. With a calm, unhurried cadence, Victor publicly executed Charles Kensington's financial reputation. He stated, loud enough for every billionaire and socialite in the room to hear, that Charles was currently $40 million in debt to the Thorne Syndicate. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Victor did not stop. He detailed the leveraged assets, the frozen offshore accounts, and the desperate, pathetic begging Charles had done in Victor's office just 3 days prior. He stripped away the billionaire's armor, exposing him as a fraud, a man drowning in syndicate money, living on borrowed time. Charles collapsed to his knees, his face buried in his hands, completely destroyed. Victor turned his attention back to the trembling heiress. He ordered Astoria to look at Maeve. Astoria sobbed, her hollow cheeks wet with mascara-stained tears. She looked at the plus-size event coordinator sitting in the lap of the most dangerous man in the city. Victor commanded Astoria to apologize. He demanded that she address Maeve with the absolute respect she deserved, or he would call in her father's debt tonight, leaving them homeless by morning. Astoria choked on a sob. She bowed her head, her voice trembling, and offered a broken, humiliating apology to Maeve. She begged for forgiveness, her toxic pride completely shattered. Maeve sat in stunned silence, her heart hammering against Victor's chest. She had spent her entire life shrinking, apologizing for her size, swallowing the cruelty of the elite, and in less than 3 minutes, this terrifying mafia boss had dismantled her tormentors and laid their dignity at her feet. Before Maeve could process the magnitude of what had just happened, Bradley Sterling burst through the crowd. The corrupt regional director was sweating profusely, his face pale with terror. He saw Maeve sitting in Victor's lap and immediately assumed the worst. Desperate to appease the Thorn Syndicate and protect his own miserable life, Bradley pointed a shaking finger at Maeve. He screamed that she was clumsy, incompetent, and a liability. He loudly declared that she was fired on the spot, ordering her to get out of the building before she caused any more damage to the agency's reputation. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. The medical debt. The past due notices. The eviction. The crushing reality of her economic desperation came crashing back down on her. She had just lost her only source of income. She tried to stand, panic clawing at her throat, but Victor's arm tightened around her waist like an iron band. Victor looked at Bradley. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Victor calmly stated that Bradley was mistaken. He declared that Maeve was not fired. He stated that her termination was mutual, effective immediately, because she was far too brilliant to work for a pathetic, money-laundering rat. Bradley's eyes widened in sheer terror. The mention of money laundering in a public space was a death sentence. Victor continued, his voice dripping with icy contempt. He announced that the Thorn Syndicate was officially cutting all ties with Bradley's agency. He promised Bradley that by the end of the week, his company would be bankrupt, his assets seized, and his life completely ruined. Bradley stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. He had just lost his biggest client, and he knew the Romano Syndicate would kill him for losing his legitimate front. Maeve's mind was spinning. The adrenaline crash hit her hard. She shifted her weight, trying to finally stand up, but a sharp, blinding pain shot through her right ankle. She gasped, her face twisting in agony. The awkward angle of the trip had severely sprained her ankle, and the adrenaline had masked the pain until now. She slumped back against Victor's chest, her breathing ragged. Victor felt her wince. His demeanor shifted instantly from cold executioner to fierce protector. Without a single word, Victor stood up. As he rose, he scooped Maeve entirely into his arms. He lifted her 200-plus-pound frame as easily as if she were made of silk and air. He cradled her against his broad chest, one massive arm supporting her back, the other hooked securely under her knees. Maeve gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to grip his broad shoulders. She was hyper-aware of her size, of the sheer amount of space she occupied, but in Victor's arms, she felt entirely secure. He did not strain. He did not hesitate. He held her with a possessive strength that made her feel lighter than she ever had in her life. Victor turned and began to walk toward the exit. Kieran Vance stepped forward, clearing the path. The sea of billionaires, socialites, and corrupt executives parted in stunned, terrified silence. No one dared to speak. No one dared to breathe. Maeve buried her face in the crook of Victor's neck, hiding from the staring eyes of the elite. She inhaled the scent of cedar and gunpowder, her heart racing as the apex predator carried her out of the glittering fortress and into the cold Manhattan night. Outside the Grand Astor, a massive, armored black Rolls-Royce sat idling at the curb. The heavy doors were opened by silent men in dark suits. Victor ducked his head and carefully placed Maeve into the plush leather interior of the back seat, sliding in right beside her. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing out the noise of the city. The acoustic isolation of the armored vehicle was absolute. Maeve pressed herself against the far door, her chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack began to set in. She gripped her hair, her breathing shallow and frantic. She told him that her life was over. She rambled about the $98,000 in medical debt, the student loans, the rent that was due in 3 days. She told him that she had no safety net, no family, and now, no job. She asked him why he had done that, why he had drawn so much attention to her, why he had ruined everything. Victor did not interrupt her. He sat perfectly still, letting her pour out her terror. He reached into a hidden compartment, poured a small measure of amber liquid into a crystal glass, and held it out to her. He commanded her to drink. Maeve took the glass with trembling hands and swallowed the liquor. The burn grounded her, forcing her to take a deep breath. Victor reached forward and tapped a button on the console. A small, high-definition screen lowered from the partition. He told her to look at the screen. Maeve blinked, focusing on the live news broadcast playing on the monitor. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking news." The footage showed the front entrance of the Grand Astor Hotel. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents in tactical gear were swarming the building. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the terrified faces of the elite guests being pushed back by the police line. The camera zoomed in as 2 federal agents dragged a sobbing, handcuffed Bradley Sterling out of the hotel doors. Maeve's jaw dropped. She stared at the screen in absolute shock. Victor leaned back against the leather seat, his dark eyes watching her profile. He explained with chilling calmness that the FBI had been building a massive racketeering case against the Romano Syndicate for 2 years. He revealed that Bradley Sterling's agency was the primary vehicle for laundering the mafia's dirty money. Victor stated that the raid had been scheduled for tonight. He told her that if she had been an employee of that agency when the federal agents breached the ballroom, her name would have been swept up in the massive federal indictment. She would have been facing decades in federal prison for conspiracy, simply by association. Maeve felt the blood freeze in her veins. She looked at Victor, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he was saying. Victor reached out, his large hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was startlingly tender for a man of such violence. He told her that by forcing Bradley to fire her publicly, in front of hundreds of witnesses, just minutes before the raid, he had legally severed her from the company. He had created an undeniable public record of her termination. He had saved her from federal prison. Maeve stared at him, her breathing shallow. She asked him how he knew about the raid, and more importantly, why he cared what happened to a random event coordinator. Victor's eyes darkened. He told her that he knew everything that happened in his city, and he told her that she was not random. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly through the streets of Manhattan, pulling into the heavily guarded underground garage of a massive, sleek skyscraper. This was the Obsidian Hotel, Victor Thorne's newly acquired, ultra-luxurious, legitimate fortress. It was a symbol of clean, impenetrable power, a monument to his absolute control over the city. The doors opened, and before Maeve could even attempt to walk on her throbbing ankle, Victor scooped her up into his arms again. He carried her to a private, biometric elevator that shot them up to the top floor. The doors opened into a sprawling, multi-level penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline of New York City. The luxury was staggering, a stark, painful contrast to Maeve's cramped, decaying apartment in Queens. Victor carried her to a massive velvet sofa and set her down gently. Within seconds, an older man with a medical bag entered the room. Victor introduced him as his private doctor. The doctor worked in absolute silence, efficiently examining Maeve's ankle, applying a cooling gel, and wrapping it in a firm, supportive bandage. He left a bottle of painkillers on the table and exited the penthouse without saying a single word. Maeve sat on the sofa, feeling entirely out of her depth. She looked down at her solid thighs, her soft stomach, her cheap, chafing uniform. She felt like an imposter in this fortress of wealth and power. Victor stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, pouring himself a drink. He looked out over the city, his broad back to her. He began to speak, his deep voice filling the massive room. He told her that he had been watching her for months. He had observed her hyper-competence, her brilliant, aggressive vendor negotiations, and the way she single-handedly kept Bradley's pathetic agency from collapsing. He turned to face her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He told her that the Obsidian Hotel was opening in 4 weeks. It was his crown jewel, the legitimate front that would permanently elevate the Thorne Syndicate above the filth of the streets. He needed someone to run it. Someone who understood logistics, power dynamics, and absolute loyalty. Victor offered her the position of Director of Operations for the Obsidian Hotel. He named a salary that was so massive, so incomprehensibly large, that it would wipe out her mother's medical debt in a single month. Maeve's breath hitched. Her mind reeled. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. A lifeline thrown to her in the darkest moment of her life. But the years of societal conditioning, the endless microaggressions, and the deep-seated insecurities clawed their way to the surface. She looked away from him, staring at her hands. She told him that he was making a mistake. She gestured to her body, her voice trembling with a mixture of shame and defiance. She told him to look at her. She reminded him of the world they lived in, the high society that demanded perfection, thinness, and aristocratic grace. She told him that the elite would never respect a size 20 woman from Queens running the most luxurious hotel in Manhattan. She told him she was not the right aesthetic for his empire. Victor set his glass down on the marble table. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He knelt in front of the sofa, forcing himself to be at eye level with her. He reached out, his massive hands framing her face. His palms were warm, rough with calluses, and incredibly gentle. He forced her to look into his eyes. Victor violently rejected her insecurity. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble, vibrating with absolute conviction. He told her that the women she was comparing herself to were fragile, starving ghosts. He told her that they were hollow vessels, desperate for validation from men who despised them. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. He told her that she was real. He declared that her body, her mind, and her resilience were the only true substance he had found in this entire rotting city. He told her that she was a queen, and it was time she stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. Victor leaned in closer, his lips mere inches from hers. The scent of cedar and danger wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. He vowed to her, swearing on his life and his empire, that he would stand behind her. He promised that if any guest, any billionaire, or any socialite ever disrespected her again, he would personally ruin them. He would give her total operational control, and his heavily armed men would ensure her absolute authority. The heavy silence stretched between them, thick with simmering tension and unspoken promises. Maeve looked into the dark, lethal eyes of the mafia boss, seeing the absolute truth in his words. He was offering her the world, and all she had to do was claim it. She felt the last remnants of her fear burn away, replaced by a deep, empowering fire. She took a slow, shuddering breath, the weight of her past falling away. Maeve looked at the apex predator, her voice steady and resolute. Victor leaned in closer, his lips mere inches from hers. The scent of cedar and danger wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. He vowed to her, swearing on his life and his empire, that he would stand behind her. He promised that if any guest, any billionaire, or any socialite ever disrespected her again, he would personally ruin them. He would give her total operational control, and his heavily armed men would ensure her absolute authority. The heavy silence stretched between them, thick with simmering tension and unspoken promises. Maeve looked into the dark, lethal eyes of the mafia boss, seeing the absolute truth in his words. He was offering her the world, and all she had to do was claim it. She felt the last remnants of her fear burn away, replaced by a deep, empowering fire. She took a slow, shuddering breath, the weight of her past falling away. Maeve looked at the apex predator, her voice steady and resolute. "I will do it." 4 weeks later, the world she had claimed was a glittering fortress of black marble and gold. It was the grand reopening of the Obsidian Hotel, the crown jewel of the Thorn Syndicate. The massive architectural masterpiece towered over the Manhattan skyline, a monument to clean, impenetrable power. Inside the grand lobby, the air was thick with the scent of imported white orchids and the low, thrumming energy of the city's absolute elite. The 0.1% had gathered to pay their respects to Victor Thorn. Hedge fund billionaires, corrupt politicians, and hollow socialites filled the sprawling space, their voices hushed with a mixture of awe and deep, instinctual fear. But tonight, their desperate, calculating eyes were not searching for the syndicate boss. They were looking up at the top of the grand sweeping staircase. They were looking at Maeve Gallagher. She stood at the landing, looking down at the sea of fragile, starving ghosts. She was no longer the invisible event coordinator in a cheap, chafing uniform. She was the untouchable queen of the Obsidian. She wore a custom midnight blue silk gown that draped flawlessly over her size 20 frame. The heavy, luxurious fabric did not attempt to hide her curves or shrink her presence. It celebrated her substance. It clung to her waist and flowed over her wide hips, making her look like a modern, grounded goddess among a crowd of brittle porcelain dolls. Around her neck rested a heavy collar of flawless Cartier diamonds, a gift that had been waiting in her penthouse suite that morning. The stones caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers, casting brilliant, blinding fractures across the marble walls. Maeve rested her hand on the gold railing. She felt the cool metal beneath her palm, grounding her in the reality of her new life. She had spent the last 4 weeks tearing the operational structure of the hotel down to the studs and rebuilding it with ruthless, hyper-competent precision. She had fired the lazy, entitled management staff. She had renegotiated every vendor contract with an iron fist. She had built a fortress of efficiency that even Victor's most hardened lieutenants respected. She was no longer drowning in $98,000 of medical debt. Her mother's bills were paid. Her student loans were erased. Her bank accounts were heavy with the massive salary Victor had promised her. But the true transformation was not financial. It was psychological. She looked down at the crowd and saw Astoria Kensington standing near the champagne fountain. The cruel heiress who had tripped her just a month ago was now staring up at Maeve with wide, terrified eyes. Astoria looked painfully thin, her collarbones sharp and hollow, her toxic pride completely broken. When Maeve met her gaze, Astoria immediately lowered her head in a gesture of absolute submission. Maeve did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply looked away, dismissing the heiress entirely. The power she wielded now was absolute, and she did not need to waste her breath on the irrelevant. Behind Maeve, standing in the shadows of the upper corridor, were two of Victor's heavily armed men. They wore immaculate dark suits, their eyes scanning the lobby with cold, lethal detachment. They were there to ensure that no one in the building ever forgot who Maeve belonged to. She turned away from the grand staircase, her diamond heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The main event was running flawlessly, but her hyper-competent mind refused to rest. She needed to check the VIP corridors on the third floor, where the private poker rooms were located. The third floor was a stark contrast to the glittering chaos of the lobby. The corridors were lined with dark mahogany paneling and thick, sound-absorbing carpets. The air was cool and silent, smelling faintly of expensive cigars and aged leather. Maeve walked down the long hallway, her tablet in hand, reviewing the security rotations. She was entirely focused on the logistics, her mind calculating the flow of high-stakes cash moving through the private rooms. She did not hear the footsteps behind her. The thick carpet swallowed the sound completely. It was only when the heavy scent of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and chemical desperation hit her senses that she realized she was not alone. Before she could turn, a rough, trembling hand clamped down hard over her mouth. Maeve gasped against the dirty palm, her eyes widening in shock. A heavy arm wrapped around her throat, dragging her backward into the dark recess of an empty service alcove. The cold, unforgiving steel of a silenced Glock was pressed violently against her soft stomach. The man holding her was breathing heavily, his chest heaving against her back. He smelled of rotting paranoia and unchecked addiction. He leaned his face close to her ear, his voice a frantic, wet whisper. He told her not to make a single sound, or he would empty the magazine into her gut and leave her to bleed out on the expensive carpet. Maeve's heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline spiked in her veins, cold and sharp. She forced herself to remain perfectly still, her mind racing to identify the threat. The man slowly removed his hand from her mouth, keeping the barrel of the gun pressed hard into her flesh. He spun her around, slamming her back against the mahogany wall. Maeve stared into the bloodshot, unhinged eyes of Julian Romano. He was the son of Elias Romano, the aging boss of the rival mafia family. Julian was a known liability, a violent, unpredictable addict who had been slowly destroying his father's empire from the inside. Tonight, he looked completely unraveled. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was pale and sweating, and his hands shook violently as he gripped the weapon. Julian sneered at her, his eyes darting nervously down the empty corridor. He spat her name like it was a curse. He told her that she was a massive, ugly problem. He laughed, a dry, manic sound that echoed in the small alcove. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her size 20 frame with deep, venomous disgust. He whispered that Victor Thorne must be losing his mind to put a fat, pathetic civilian in charge of his empire. He tried to use the old weapons of high society against her. He tried to make her feel large, clumsy, and unworthy of the space she occupied. For a fraction of a second, the old Maeve flared to life. The frightened girl from Queens who had spent her entire life apologizing for her body felt a familiar, suffocating wave of shame, but the wave crashed against the impenetrable armor of her new reality. Maeve looked at the sweating, pathetic man holding a gun to her stomach. She did not see a terrifying mafia prince. She saw a weak, dying animal lashing out in its final moments. She lifted her chin, the Cartier diamonds catching the dim light of the alcove. She did not shrink. She expanded. She let her presence fill the small space, her voice dropping to a calm, icy register. She asked Julian exactly how much money his family had lost this week. Julian flinched as if she had struck him. His bloodshot eyes widened in shock. His gun trembled against her stomach. He screamed at her, his voice cracking with panic. He demanded to know what she had done. He revealed that the Romano family was bleeding millions of dollars. Their legitimate front companies were collapsing. Their supply chains were severed. He told her that Durians Deros, Dingan, Deresive, and it was all because of the aggressive, suffocating contracts she had forced upon the city's vendors. Julian pressed the gun harder into her flesh. He told her that he was going to kill her right now. He was going to leave her body in the corridor to send a message to Victor Thorne. He was going to prove that the Romanos were not dead yet. Maeve stared down the barrel of the gun. She did not beg. She did not cry. She looked Julian dead in the eye and told him that if he pulled that trigger, Victor would not just kill him. Victor would dismantle his entire bloodline, burn his father alive, and erase the Romano name from the history of New York City. Julian's face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. He tightened his finger on the trigger. He opened his mouth to speak his final threat. The temperature in the alcove dropped to absolute zero. The air pressure violently shifted, as if a massive, invisible force had just entered the confined space. Julian did not even have time to turn his head. A massive hand, clad in a black leather glove, shot out from the shadows. It clamped down over the top of Julian's weapon and the slide of the Glock with terrifying, blinding speed. Victor Thorne did not yell. He did not announce his presence. He moved with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator executing a kill. With a brutal, sickening twist, Victor wrenched the gun upward. The sound of Julian's wrist snapping echoed through the corridor like a dry branch breaking in half. Julian let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream. The silenced Glock clattered uselessly to the thick carpet. Before Julian could draw another breath, Victor's other hand shot forward. He grabbed the Mafia prince by the throat, lifting him entirely off the ground. Victor slammed Julian backward into the opposite wall with such catastrophic force that the heavy mahogany paneling cracked down the center. Maeve gasped, pressing her hands against the wall behind her as she watched the wrath of Thorne unleash itself. Victor's face was a mask of demonic, simmering rage. The muscle in his jaw ticked violently. His dark eyes were entirely black, devoid of any human mercy. With a flick of his wrist, a heavy, matte black combat knife materialized in Victor's hand. He drove the blade forward, pinning Julian to the wall by burying the steel deep into the wood, mere millimeters from the pulsing jugular vein in Julian's neck. Julian choked, his feet kicking frantically in the air. His hands clawed weakly at Victor's massive, unyielding forearm. Tears of absolute terror streamed down his sweating face. Victor leaned in close, his face inches from the dying man. His voice was a deep, gravelly whisper that vibrated with lethal intent. He told Julian that he had made a fatal miscalculation. He stated that touching what belonged to the Thorne Syndicate was a mistake, but touching Maeve Gallagher was a death sentence. Victor did not wait for a response. He pulled the heavy combat knife from the wood and, in one fluid, brutal motion, slammed the solid steel hilt directly into Julian's temple. Julian's eyes rolled back in his head. His body went entirely limp, collapsing to the floor like a discarded rag doll. The violent, chaotic energy in the corridor vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Victor stood over the unconscious body, his broad chest heaving slightly. He slowly wiped the blade of his knife on Julian's expensive suit jacket before sliding it back into its concealed sheath. The adrenaline that had been keeping Maeve upright suddenly evaporated. The sheer terror of the last 3 minutes crashed down on her nervous system all at once. Her knees buckled. The heavy silk of her gown rustled as she began to slide down the mahogany wall. Victor moved with terrifying speed. He crossed the alcove in a single stride, catching her before she could hit the floor. His massive arms wrapped around her waist, hauling her solid frame flush against his chest. He held her with a desperate, crushing possessiveness, his large hands roaming frantically over her back, her shoulders, and her stomach, searching for blood. He demanded to know if she was hurt. His deep voice was rough, fractured by a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. Maeve shook her head, her hands gripping the lapels of his immaculate suit. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling the grounding scent of cedar, dark tobacco, and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. She whispered that she was fine. She told him that Julian had not pulled the trigger. Victor let out a long, shuddering breath. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his lips pressing hard against her pulse point. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, but she did not want him to let go. His raw, overwhelming strength was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Silent footsteps approached the alcove. Kieran Vance appeared from the shadows, his face in a motionless mask. He looked down at the unconscious, bleeding body of Julian Romano. Victor did not look up. He kept his face buried in Maeve's neck and issued a single, cold command. He told Kieran to take the trash to the basement and keep him alive until the sit-down tomorrow. Kieran nodded silently. He grabbed Julian by the collar of his ruined suit and dragged him effortlessly down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. Victor slowly pulled back, framing Maeve's face with his large, warm hands. His dark eyes searched hers, looking past the Cartier diamonds and the expensive silk, looking directly into the core of her soul. In the dim light of the blood-stained hallway, the apex predator stripped away his armor. He confessed to her. He told her that she was not just his director of operations. He told her that from the moment he caught her falling in that ballroom 4 weeks ago, she had become the center of his gravity. He stated, with absolute, terrifying conviction, that she was his everything. Maeve's breath hitched. The intensity of his words burned through her veins, incinerating the last remaining shadows of her old life. Victor did not ask for permission. He leaned down and captured her lips in a desperate, fiercely possessive kiss. It was not a gentle kiss. It was acclaiming. It tasted of adrenaline, power, and absolute devotion. Maeve opened her mouth to him, her hands sliding up into his dark hair, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with all the heavy, grounded passion she possessed, cementing the bond between them in the shadows of the empire they were building together. When they finally broke apart, Victor rested his forehead against hers. He promised her that the Romano problem would be permanently solved by tomorrow night. An hour later, the chaos of the grand reopening was far below them. Maeve and Victor were sealed inside the absolute security of the penthouse suite. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the glittering Manhattan skyline. But Maeve was not looking at the city. She was sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa, a crystal tumbler of 50-year-old Macallan resting in her hands. Victor stood by the heavy oak desk, pouring his own drink. He had discarded his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his dark dress shirt, exposing the thick, corded muscle of his forearms. Maeve took a slow sip of the scotch, the amber liquid burning a warm path down her throat. She looked at Victor, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She asked him to explain what Julian had been screaming about. She told Victor that she had not touched the Romano family's money. She had spent the last 4 weeks entirely focused on the hotel's logistics. She had renegotiated the linen contracts, the imported food suppliers, and the private security firms. She had cut out the bloated, corrupt vendors and replaced them with efficient, clean operations. Victor turned to face her, a slow, deeply proud smile spreading across his face. It was a rare expression, one that softened the lethal angles of his jaw. He walked over and sat down on the heavy marble coffee table directly in front of her. He reached out, his large hands resting gently on her bare knees. He explained the reality of the corporate syndicate war. He told her that the bloated, corrupt vendors she had ruthlessly cut from the hotel's supply chain were not independent businesses. They were the legitimate front companies for the Romano Mafia. Victor explained that the old-school mafia relied on massive, overpriced contracts with luxury hotels to launder their dirty street money. By auditing the hotel's finances and aggressively terminating those contracts, Maeve had inadvertently severed the Romanos' primary arteries of cash flow. She had not used a gun. She had not ordered a hit. She had used her hyper-competent brilliance, her spreadsheets, and her absolute refusal to accept inefficiency. Victor looked at her with a reverence that bordered on worship. He told her that his men had been fighting a bloody street war with the Romanos for 2 years, trying to bleed them out. But Maeve, sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee and a tablet, had systematically bankrupted the rival syndicate in less than 30 days. She had dismantled them legally. She was a financial assassin, and she had not even realized it. Maeve stared at him, her mind racing as the pieces fell into place. The realization of her own devastating power washed over her. She had destroyed the men who used to terrify her, simply by doing her job perfectly. Victor reached up and traced the line of her jaw. He told her that Elias Romano had called for a desperate final sit-down tomorrow night. The old boss was cornered, bleeding out, and begging for terms of surrender. Victor looked deep into her eyes. He told her that he was not going to the sit-down alone. He told her that the Queen of the Obsidian was going to deliver the final blow. The following evening, the atmosphere inside the private dining room at Le Bernardin was suffocatingly tense. The exclusive Manhattan restaurant was famous for its delicate seafood and its impenetrable discretion. The private room in the back was entirely soundproofed, guarded by heavily armed men from both syndicates. Elias Romano sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He was an aging, desperate man, his face lined with decades of stress and violence. He wore a sharp, old-school pinstripe suit, but the fabric hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He was flanked by his 2 remaining capos, men who looked nervous and exhausted. Elias expected Victor Thorne to walk through the doors with an army of muscle. He expected a brutal, screaming negotiation over territory, blood, and the return of his captive son, Julian. The heavy oak doors swung open. Victor Thorne walked into the room. He radiated the terrifying, predatory stillness that had made him the undisputed king of the city. But Victor did not walk in alone. By his side, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, was Maeve Gallagher. She wore a tailored, dark charcoal power suit that hugged her heavy curves with immaculate precision. The Cartier diamonds rested against her collarbone, a blinding symbol of her untouchable status. She carried a single, slim black leather folder. Elias Romano's eyes narrowed in deep, misogynistic confusion. He looked at Maeve's size 20 frame, his lip curling in disgust. He looked at Victor and demanded to know why the head of the Thorne Syndicate had brought a civilian woman to a mafia sit-down. He insulted her, calling her a secretary, and ordered Victor to send her out into the hallway so the men could speak. Victor did not say a word. He pulled out a heavy leather chair at the center of the table and gestured for Maeve to sit. Once she was seated, Victor did not take the chair next to her. He stood directly behind her, his massive hands resting possessively on the back of her chair. He was the muscle. She was the executioner. Maeve looked across the table at the aging mafia boss. She felt no fear. The men in this room were relics, fading ghosts clinging to a world that no longer existed. She opened the black leather folder and placed it flat on the mahogany table. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the calm, unhurried cadence of a woman who held absolute control over the room. She read a sequence of 12 numbers aloud. Elias Romano froze. The color drained entirely from his weathered face. Maeve continued. She read a second sequence of numbers, then a third. She looked up from the folder, her eyes locking onto Elias. She explained, with clinical precision, that those were the routing numbers for the Romano family's hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She told him that as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, those accounts had been completely frozen by international banking authorities. Panic erupted in the eyes of the Romano capos. They looked at their boss, realizing that their entire financial safety net had just been vaporized. Maeve did not stop. She dropped the financial kill shot directly onto the table. She revealed that the shell companies Elias used to hide his assets had been legally dissolved. She stated that a highly detailed, anonymous dossier containing every fraudulent transaction, every laundered dollar, and every forged signature had been compiled. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the leather folder. She told Elias that the dossier was currently sitting on a secure server. If she did not enter a cancellation code by midnight, the files would be automatically emailed to the lead prosecutor of the Federal Racketeering Task Force. Elias Romano slammed his fists onto the table, his face turning a violent shade of purple. He lost his temper completely. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger directly at Maeve's face. He screamed that she was a dead woman. He threatened to have her hunted down, to have her carved into pieces, to make her suffer for daring to touch his empire. The threat hung in the air for exactly 1 second. Victor Thorne moved. He stepped out from behind Maeve's chair. His hand blurred toward his waist. With a sound like a thunderclap, Victor slammed his heavy combat knife directly into the center of the mahogany table. The massive steel blade buried itself 3 inches deep into the expensive wood, vibrating with lethal force. The Romano capos flinched, reaching for weapons they were not allowed to carry in the room. Victor leaned over the table, his massive frame casting a terrifying shadow over the aging boss. His voice was a low, demonic rumble that shook the crystal glasses on the table. He told Elias to lower his hand. Victor declared, with absolute, terrifying authority, that Elias was not speaking to a secretary. He was not speaking to a civilian. Victor looked Elias dead in the eye and stated that he was speaking to the future wife of Victor Thorne. The words echoed through the silent room, heavy and absolute. Maeve's heart skipped a beat, the magnitude of his declaration washing over her. He was not just giving her power, he was binding his entire empire to her name. Victor demanded absolute respect. He promised Elias that if he ever raised his voice to Maeve again, Victor would bypass the federal prosecutors entirely and slowly sever Elias's head from his shoulders. Elias Romano slowly sank back into his chair, completely defeated. The fight drained out of him, leaving only the hollow shell of a ruined man. Maeve took a slow breath, centering herself. She closed the leather folder. She delivered the final ultimatum. She told Elias that he had 2 choices. He could sign over all remaining Romano territories in Brooklyn to the Thorne Syndicate, surrender his legitimate properties, and retire quietly to Florida. Or he could spend the rest of his miserable life rotting in a federal penitentiary while his son Julian was buried in an unmarked grave. She looked at her watch. She told him he had 60 seconds to decide. Elias did not need 60 seconds. He looked at the combat knife buried in the table. He looked at the terrifying syndicate boss standing behind the brilliant, untouchable woman. The old mafia boss bowed his head, his voice a broken whisper. He surrendered. 2 hours later, the armored Rolls-Royce pulled into the underground garage of the Obsidian Hotel. The war was over. The Thorne Syndicate now held absolute, uncontested control over the city. Victor and Maeve rode the biometric elevator up to the penthouse in heavy, simmering silence. The adrenaline of the victory was thick in the air, charging the confined space with an electric, undeniable tension. The moment the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, Victor did not hesitate. He grabbed Maeve by the waist, spinning her around and pinning her back against the heavy oak doors. The impact was solid, grounding, and deeply possessive. He looked down at her, his dark eyes blazing with a mixture of awe, pride, and overwhelming desire. He reached up, his large hands tangling in her hair, tilting her head back. He told her that she was magnificent. He told her that watching her dismantle those men, watching her wield her brilliance like a weapon, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Maeve looked up at the apex predator. She felt the heavy Cartier diamonds against her skin. She felt the solid, undeniable reality of her size 20 body pressed against his massive frame. She had spent her entire life shrinking, trying to make herself invisible in a world that demanded fragile perfection. She had believed that her body was a burden, a flaw that needed to be hidden. But Victor Thorne had shown her the truth. Her body was her armor. Her mind was her weapon. Her substance was her absolute power. She reached up, her hands gripping the broad shoulders of the man who had given her the world. She pulled him down to her. Victor kissed her fiercely, his mouth devouring hers with a desperate, unyielding hunger. It was a kiss that promised a lifetime of absolute protection, endless luxury, and terrifying devotion. Maeve Gallagher closed her eyes and kissed him back. She was the queen of the obsidian. She had claimed her space in the world, and she would never, ever be invisible again.